Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping into the world of beekeeping, and you're not going to believe this, but we're going to see how a measurement, just a few millimeters wide, actually stalled innovation for 100 years and kicked off this huge rivalry between two continents. Okay, so let's start with a puzzle. Back in the 1800s, beekeeping had this game-changing invention, the movable frame. Super simple idea, right? It let beekeepers check on a hive without totally wrecking the honeycomb. But here's the weird part. In Germany, which was like the center of beekeeping science, these supposedly movable frames kept getting hopelessly glued shut. So what was the deal? To get to the bottom of this, we have to understand a basic rule, a biological law that every single honeybee lives by. It's totally hardwired into them, and it basically dictates how they build everything. You see, bees are just incredible little engineers. If they find a crack or a gap in their hive that's too small for them to get through, we're talking anything less than about 6.4 millimeters, they just won't leave it. They seal it up tight with this sticky stuff called propolis. People call it bee glue, and for good reason. It cements things together. Now, on the flip side, if they find a space that's too big, say anything over about 9.5 millimeters, they look at that and think, nope, that's wasted space. So they get to work and fill it in with this messy, extra honeycomb that beekeepers call burrcomb. And that stuff basically welds the frames right to the hive walls. So what you have is this kind of magic window. It's a very precise gap right between 6.4 and 9.5 millimeters that bees just respect. It's not small enough to seal, and it's not big enough to build in. To them, it's a perfect hallway, so they leave it alone. And that perfect little gap? That is known as Beespace. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. This critical idea was discovered at almost the exact same time on both sides of the Atlantic, but the way each side understood it and what they did with it, well, that's what created a 100-year split. I mean, just look at these dates. This was a photo finish. Over in Europe, you had pioneers like Jan Dzierzon using 8mm grooves, way back in 1848. Then, in May of 1852, August von Berlepsch shows off his movable frame design. And just a few months later, in October, an American named L.L. Langstroth patents his own hive. It was so close that it started this huge argument, especially in Europe, about who really got there first. And right here, this is where things went in two totally different directions. The Germans, they were focused on something called the Wabengasse, which pretty much means comb gangway. For them, that magic measurement was just about the space between the frames, so the bees could walk through. But Langstroth's American idea of bee space was totally different. It was a universal law for the whole hive. It wasn't just about the space between frames, but the space around the entire frame, top, bottom, and all sides. This chart just lays it all out, plain and simple. You can see the goal of the German Wabengasse was just about letting bees get around. But the goal of Langstroth's bee space was all about making the frame easy to move for the beekeeper. One was a rule for bee traffic, the other was a law for the hive's architecture. And the result? Well, the German frames kept getting glued in, while Langstroth's frames, they could be lifted out, smooth as silk, every single time. So the big question is, why did Langstroth's big idea take over the entire world, while the German one just led to a century of beekeepers wrestling with stuck frames? Well, the answer wasn't the frame, the answer was the box. See, the typical German hive back then opened from the back. You'd pull the frames out one by one, kind of like turning pages in a book. Because of that, you could kind of ignore it if the sides and bottom got stuck. You could just pry them loose. But Langstroth's hive, it was a stackable box you opened from the top. The frames were like files in a filing cabinet. For that system to work at all, you had to be able to lift the frame straight up and out. That meant the bee space had to be perfect all the way around. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a structural necessity. And what that meant was that for 100 years, an entire century, German beekeepers had invented movable frames that, in the real world, were totally fixed in place. They had the right idea, but they literally had the wrong box. They'd solved the problem on paper, but not in practice. So let's wrap this up. What's the big lesson we can pull from this 100-year holdup? It all comes down to this one simple, tiny gap. The thing is, it wasn't just one thing that went wrong. It was like a perfect storm of problems. First, you had national pride. They wanted to give credit to their local guys. Second, the hive boxes they were already using were completely incompatible with this new universal idea. Third, their own terminology, that Wabengasse idea, actually blinded them to the real problem. And get this, even their philosophy about keeping hives warm made them build smaller gaps, which of course, the bees immediately sealed up. In the end, what made Langstroth a genius wasn't just that he noticed the space. His real breakthrough was realizing that this little biological quirk had to become an absolute, non-negotiable rule for engineering the entire hive. He took something he saw bees do and turned it into the blueprint for a standardized, modular system, the very system that powers almost all modern beekeeping today. You know, this whole story, an entire industry stuck for a century because of just a few millimeters, it really makes you think, doesn't it? What tiny, overlooked details, what little bee spaces are we all missing right now in our own fields? What's the simple thing that could change everything if only our current systems were built to see it?